Authorities say her body was found in her apartment in Fort Bend County, along with the body of a man who killed her on Sunday.
He hadn't heard from his daughter in days, and when he forced his way into her apartment, he wasn't met with chaos or broken doors. He was met with something far worse. His daughter, the woman millions knew online as Mercedes Moor, was dead. Her body had been concealed inside a red trash bag. Upstairs, another man was inside the apartment too. Police called it a homicide. The investigation ended quickly, but the most important questions were never answered. How does a stranger enter a private home without breaking in? Why was the final discovery left to her father? And how did this case close with so many gaps still wide open? When silence became fear. In the days leading up to August 20 to 21, something unusual happened. Mercedes Moor stopped responding. Calls went unanswered. Messages weren't returned. For someone who stayed regularly in touch with her family, the silence stood out. At first, there was no immediate reason to assume danger. Adults miss calls, phones die, busy days turn into quiet ones. But as time passed, the absence of any response became harder to ignore. The lack of activity wasn't just online, it was personal. Her father tried repeatedly to reach her. When those attempts failed, concern escalated into alarm. This was no longer a case of waiting it out. Something felt wrong enough that he decided to go to her apartment himself, located at the Cortland Apartments in Richmond, Texas. There was no report of an argument, no known dispute, no warning message, just silence. When he arrived at the complex, there was nothing outwardly alarming. No broken windows, no damaged doors. The apartment appeared undisturbed from the outside. But when he attempted to make contact and still received no response, he made the decision to enter. What happened next would permanently change the direction of the case. Inside the apartment, he discovered his daughter dead. Her body had been concealed inside a red trash bag. The scene immediately indicated something far beyond a medical emergency. This was not an accident. This was not natural causes. Authorities were contacted. Police arrived and secured the apartment. As the initial shock of the discovery settled, investigators began to assess what they were dealing with. Very quickly, it became clear that Mercedes Moor had been killed. The situation became even more disturbing when officers discovered a second person inside the apartment. A man was found upstairs. He was later identified as Kevin Alexander Accordo, a 34-year-old from Florida. From the very beginning, police stated something that would define the entire case. There were no signs of forced entry. The apartment door had not been broken. No locks appeared damaged. There was no immediate evidence that anyone had forced their way inside. That single detail raised a question that has never been fully answered. If no one broke in, how did another man end up inside her apartment? At this stage, investigators had only fragments: a father's discovery, a concealed body, and a second individual inside the home. The timeline was still unclear. The connection between the two people inside the apartment had not been established. What was certain was this: the silence that triggered a father's fear had uncovered a homicide, and a scene that defied easy explanation. Inside the apartment, once police secured the apartment, the focus shifted to documenting what had been found inside. Every detail mattered, especially because there were no signs of forced entry. In cases like this, the condition of the scene often determines the direction of the investigation. Mercedes Moor was found deceased inside her own home. Her body had been placed inside a red trash bag, an act that immediately suggested intentional concealment rather than panic or accident. The placement indicated time, effort, and awareness. This was not a spontaneous event. As investigators moved through the apartment, they made another discovery that deepened the mystery. Upstairs, inside the same residence, they found Kevin Accordo. He was also deceased. Police later stated that Accordo had died by suicide. The medical examiner would rule his death the result of multiple sharp force injuries. His death occurred after Mercedes Moor had already been killed. The presence of two bodies inside a locked apartment raised immediate questions. Police were clear about one point early on. They did not believe Mercedes Moor and Kevin Accordo were in a relationship. There was no confirmed personal connection established at the time of the investigation. That distinction mattered. There was no public evidence of a romantic link, no known domestic dispute, no indication that this was a partner violence case. Instead, investigators were faced with a stranger scenario: a man from another state, inside the home of a woman he was not known to be connected to. Another unsettling detail came from the scene itself. A According to statements later shared by her father in media interviews, there were writings found inside the apartment. These details were not released as part of a formal police report, but they were publicly described by family members who entered the apartment before officers arrived. While the full contents of those writings were never officially published, their presence added to the sense that this was not a random encounter or burglary gone wrong. Police continued to emphasize what the scene did not show. There was no ransacking, no signs of a struggle extending through the apartment, no broken furniture or smashed entry points. The apartment did not look like a forced intrusion had taken place. That absence of disruption made one question unavoidable: access. If Kevin Accordo did not break in, how did he get inside? Did he follow her in? Was he led inside? Did he have access through another means? Investigators did not publicly answer these questions, and no definitive explanation was released. What authorities did confirm was the manner of death. The Fort Bend County medical examiner ruled that Mercedes Moor died by strangulation and suffered a traumatic concussion. Her death was officially classified as a homicide. Accordo's death was ruled a suicide. With that ruling, the criminal investigation effectively ended. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no interrogation explaining how the night unfolded. What remained was a closed case with open questions rooted entirely inside that apartment, where one woman lost her life and the person believed responsible was never able to explain how or why he was there, who she was before that day. Before her name appeared in headlines, Mercedes Moor was known almost entirely through her online presence. Under the name Miss Mercedes Moor, she had built a massive following on Instagram, numbering in the millions. Her page was public, highly visible, and algorithmically amplified, the kind of exposure that placed her far beyond a private individual. To her audience, she was confident, glamorous, and constantly present. To her family, she was a daughter who lived independently, maintained regular contact, and managed her own life away from home. Behind the online persona was her legal identity, Janae Lynn Gagne. That distinction mattered after her death because it highlighted the divide between who she was publicly and how little was actually known about her private routines. While millions could see her posts, far fewer knew where she lived, who she trusted, or how her daily life functioned offline. At the time of her death, she was living alone in an apartment in Richmond, Texas. The complex itself was not described by police as unsafe or compromised. There were no public reports of prior disturbances, ongoing threats, or known disputes connected to her residence. Her online activity, however, placed her in a category of visibility that carried its own risks. Her posts were frequent, her location was broadly identifiable, her life was accessible in fragments to anyone watching closely enough. Still, investigators did not publicly link her death to a specific post, message, or online interaction. No warning signs were officially identified. No previous police reports suggested she had been targeted or stalked in a way that had reached law enforcement. This absence of documented warning has fueled speculation online, but officially, the record remains limited. Police acknowledge that they were examining possible social media connections, but no confirmed digital trail tying her directly to the man found in her apartment was ever publicly released. What is clear is that her life, at least outwardly, showed no signs of immediate danger. There was no public breakdown, no emergency call, no message asking for help. The suddenness of her death, contrasted with the visibility of her life, is one of the reasons the case drew such intense attention. In the end, her public identity became inseparable from the way the case unfolded. Her visibility ensured that the crime would not go unnoticed, but it also created a flood of speculation that obscured what little verified information existed. The man found upstairs. The second body found inside the apartment belonged to Kevin Alexander Accordo. He was 34 years old and originally from Florida. Beyond those basic facts, very little about him was made public. Police identified Accordo as the suspected killer shortly after the discovery. His body was found upstairs inside the same apartment where Mercedes Moor was killed. The medical examiner later ruled his death a suicide. From the outset, investigators emphasized one critical point. They did not believe Accordo and Mercedes Moor had a personal relationship. There was no confirmed romantic involvement. No known friendship, no established connection that could immediately explain why he was there. That lack of an apparent relationship set this case apart from many domestic homicide investigations. This was not framed as an argument that escalated. It was not described as an intimate partner dispute. Instead, authorities were confronted with a man who appeared in a private residence without a clear reason for being there. Accordo was from out of state. There was no public indication that he lived nearby or had ties to the apartment complex. Police did not release details about how long he had been in Texas when he arrived, or how he traveled to the area. They also did not publicly disclose whether Accordo had communicated with Mercedes Moor prior to the incident. Investigators stated they were reviewing social media and electronic records, but no findings confirming contact were ever shared. This absence of information left a narrow but troubling outline. A man with no known relationship found dead inside the apartment of a woman he was believed to have killed. Another detail continued to complicate the picture. There was no sign of forced entry. Accordo did not break his way in. The door was not damaged. The locks were not reported as compromised. How he entered remained unexplained because Accordo died at the scene. Investigators lost the only person who could have explained his presence. There would be no interrogation, no timeline reconstructed through questioning, no opportunity to establish motive directly from the source. With his death ruled a suicide, the case reached a legal endpoint quickly. The suspected offender was deceased. There would be no charges, no trial, and no courtroom examination of the facts. What remained was a case defined by absence, absent explanations, absent connections, and absent answers. Accordo's role was officially labeled, but the details surrounding how he crossed into Mercedes Moor's private space were never fully resolved. The man found upstairs became both the conclusion of the investigation and the reason it could never be complete. What the evidence established. As investigators worked through the apartment and reviewed the scene, responsibility for determining what happened shifted from police to the medical examiner. While law enforcement could document where bodies were found and what the scene looked like, only forensic findings could establish how the deaths occurred. The Fort Bend County medical examiner ruled that Mercedes Moor died from strangulation. In addition to that, she had suffered a traumatic concussion, indicating significant force had been used. Her death was officially classified as a homicide. These findings confirmed what was already evident from the scene. This was not an accident, and it was not natural causes. Someone had intentionally caused her death. The medical examiner also ruled on the death of Kevin Accordo. His death was classified as a suicide, with the cause listed as multiple sharp force injuries. The ruling indicated that his death occurred after Mercedes Moor had already been killed. Together, these determinations established the basic framework of the case. Mercedes Moor was murdered. The man believed responsible died by suicide inside the same apartment. With no surviving suspect, the criminal investigation had nowhere further to go. However, while the forensic findings explained how both deaths occurred, they did not explain the circumstances surrounding them. The medical examiner could not determine how Accordo gained access to the apartment, why he was there, or what interactions took place before the fatal encounter. Police confirmed that there were no signs of forced entry. This detail was consistent throughout the investigation and became one of its most troubling elements. The absence of a break-in suggested that access had occurred in a way that left no visible damage, a fact that raised questions but provided no answers. Authorities didn't release information about recovered digital evidence, if any existed. No timeline of communications was made public. No explanation was offered for how long Accordo had been inside the apartment or when the confrontation began. Because the suspect was deceased, investigators could not establish motive through questioning. Any explanation for why the crime occurred would have to come from circumstantial evidence alone. In this case, little of that evidence was made public. As a result, the official findings closed the case procedurally, but left its most critical elements unresolved. The evidence confirmed that a homicide had occurred, but it did not provide a clear narrative of events leading up to it. The questions that died with him. When the investigation into Mercedes Moor's death concluded, it did so without a trial, without testimony, and without a definitive explanation of how the crime unfolded. The man believed responsible was dead, and with him went the answers that only he could have provided. The most persistent question was one of access. Police maintained that there were no signs of forced entry. That meant Accordo entered the apartment without breaking in, without damaging locks, and without leaving evidence of intrusion. How that happened was never publicly explained. Another unresolved issue was connection. Investigators stated they didn't believe there was a personal relationship between Mercedes Moor and Kevin Accordo. No confirmed history of communication was released. If there was contact, it was never detailed. If there was none, the lack of explanation became even more troubling. Timing also remained unclear. Authorities did not release a detailed timeline of when Accordo arrived at the apartment, how long he was there, or when Mercedes Moor was killed. Without those details, the sequence of events inside the apartment couldn't be fully reconstructed. Because the suspect died by suicide, the investigation reached a natural stopping point. There was no legal mechanism to push the case further. No charges could be filed. No motive could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. In public, the case quickly became the subject of speculation. Online theories filled the gaps left by official silence. But speculation didn't change the facts recorded by police and the medical examiner. What remained was a narrow set of certainties. A woman was killed inside her own home, her body concealed, and the person believed responsible died in that same space. Everything else, how he entered, why he was there, and what happened in the moments before her death, was left unanswered.